Deeply empathetic people seem perfectly comfortable being alone. It isn't always because they dislike people. Sometimes they simply become more aware of what happens inside a relationship. They notice the forced conversations, the hidden resentment, the emotional imbalance, and the subtle ways people stop being genuine with one another. And over time, they may discover something surprising. Solitude can feel more peaceful than constantly trying to belong somewhere you don't feel emotionally safe. But what does psychology tell us about this choice? And why might emotional depth actually change the way a person experiences friendship? One of the less visible experiences of a deeply empathetic person is the amount of information they are constantly taking in from the people around them. Most of us listen primarily to the words someone speaks, but emotionally perceptive people often notice much more. They may notice a slight change in someone's tone, a pause before answering a question, a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, or the difference between what a person says and what their behavior communicates. These details may seem insignificant in isolation, but over time, they can create a pattern. And when someone is highly attentive to emotional cues, those patterns can become difficult to ignore. This doesn't mean that every empath is automatically better at reading people, or that their impressions are always correct. Human beings are complex, and we can all misinterpret one another. But emotional sensitivity can increase awareness of subtle social signals. Research in emotional intelligence has long emphasized the importance of recognizing emotions, not only in ourselves, but also in others. This kind of awareness can help us understand what may be happening beneath the surface of an interaction. Imagine, for example, a friendship where one person repeatedly says, "Everything is fine," while becoming increasingly distant, impatient, or dismissive. Someone who is highly attentive to emotional signals may sense that something has changed long before the other person openly acknowledges it. They might feel the tension in the room even when nobody talks about it. They may recognize that a conversation sounds friendly on the surface, but carries an underlying sense of competition or resentment. Over time, this awareness can become both a strength and a burden. The strength is obvious. Emotional awareness can help us respond with compassion. It can allow us to notice when someone is struggling, even when they don't have the words to explain it. It can help us approach conflict with greater sensitivity and understand that behavior often has an emotional story behind it. But there is another side. When you repeatedly notice emotional inconsistency in your relationships, you may begin to question the authenticity of those relationships. You might wonder why someone says they care but rarely shows it. You might notice that a friend only reaches out when they need something. You might sense that conversations are becoming performative rather than genuine. And eventually, the emotional cost of pretending not to notice can become greater than the discomfort of being alone. This is one reason some deeply empathetic people gradually become more selective about their relationships. They aren't necessarily rejecting people. They are becoming more conscious of the emotional quality of their connections. There is an important psychological distinction here. Emotional intelligence is not simply about detecting what other people feel. It also involves understanding our own emotional responses and regulating them wisely. Without self-awareness, sensitivity can turn into hypervigilance, where we constantly search for signs that something is wrong. But with healthy self-awareness, emotional sensitivity can become a valuable source of information rather than a source of constant anxiety. The goal, then, isn't to assume that every uncomfortable feeling means someone is being fake. The goal is to become curious, to observe patterns, to look at behavior over time, to ask yourself whether a relationship consistently creates trust, respect, and mutuality, or whether you are continually trying to explain away what your emotional awareness has already noticed. Sometimes the most emotionally intelligent response isn't confrontation. It isn't anger. It is simply creating a little distance and allowing yourself to see the relationship more clearly. And perhaps this is why solitude can become meaningful for some deeply empathetic people. When you spend less time managing emotional inconsistency, you have more space to reconnect with your own thoughts and feelings. You begin to realize that peace is not the same thing as isolation, and that being alone can sometimes be healthier than remaining surrounded by relationships that require you to constantly ignore what you sense. For a deeply empathetic person, relationships are rarely just about being around other people. Connection has a different meaning. It is not simply about having someone to talk to, spending time together, or sharing the same social circle. What often matters more is the sense that there is something genuine happening beneath the interaction. There is trust, there is openness, there is a feeling that both people can be themselves without constantly performing for one another. And when that sense of authenticity is missing, even a crowded room can begin to feel strangely lonely. This is one reason emotionally deep people may eventually become uncomfortable with superficial relationships. It isn't necessarily because they believe they are better than others or because they don't enjoy ordinary conversation. Small talk has its place. Casual friendships have their place. Not every relationship needs to become deeply intimate. The difference is that a person who values emotional depth may eventually recognize when a connection is built almost entirely on convenience, appearance, or social expectation. Think about a friendship where two people regularly meet, exchange jokes, and talk about everyday events, but neither person ever feels truly seen. When something difficult happens, the conversation quickly changes. When one person expresses vulnerability, the other becomes uncomfortable. When a disagreement appears, both people avoid the subject rather than addressing it honestly. From the outside, the friendship may look perfectly healthy. There are messages, gatherings, photographs, and shared experiences. But emotionally, something important may be missing. A deeply empathetic person may notice this absence. They may begin to ask themselves questions that they didn't ask before. Why do I feel emotionally tired after spending time with this person? Why do I feel like I have to edit myself? Why can we talk for hours and yet I still feel unseen? Why does this relationship seem to exist only when everything is easy? These questions can be uncomfortable because they challenge the idea that every long-term friendship is automatically a meaningful one. Psychologically, human beings have a powerful need for belonging. We want to feel accepted by others, and social connection plays an important role in emotional well-being. But belonging and authenticity are not always the same thing. A person can belong to a group and still feel disconnected within it. They can have many acquaintances and still lack a relationship where they feel safe enough to be honest. For an emotionally perceptive person, this difference can become increasingly important. Over time, they may become less interested in relationships that require constant emotional performance. They may no longer want to laugh when something isn't funny just to maintain harmony. They may stop pretending to agree simply to avoid conflict. They may become less willing to participate in conversations that revolve around gossip, competition, or appearances. And when they begin making these changes, some relationships naturally become more distant. This can look like withdrawal from the outside. But internally, it may be something different, a movement toward authenticity. The important thing is not to confuse emotional depth with emotional perfection. Deeply empathetic people can also misunderstand others. They can become overly sensitive, make assumptions, or interpret ordinary differences as signs of rejection. Emotional intelligence requires more than noticing emotions. It also requires checking our interpretations, communicating openly, and remaining willing to see another person's perspective. This is where maturity becomes important. The goal isn't to reject everyone who doesn't immediately understand us. It is to learn which relationships can grow through honesty and which ones consistently depend on pretending. A healthy friendship does not require two people to think alike or feel everything at the same intensity. It requires enough trust that differences can be discussed without destroying the connection. Sometimes what an emotionally deep person is really searching for is not a large number of friends, but a small number of relationships where they don't have to hide important parts of themselves. And that realization can change the way they see solitude. Being alone may no longer feel like a failure. It can become a temporary space where they recover from the pressure of constantly adapting themselves to relationships that don't feel genuine. In solitude, they may discover that peace is not the absence of people. It is the absence of emotional performance. Perhaps the deeper lesson is that meaningful connection is not measured by how many people surround us. It is measured by how safe we feel being ourselves when the right people are there. There is a difference between being alone and feeling lonely, and understanding that difference can change the way we think about solitude. In a world that constantly encourages us to stay connected, to respond immediately, and to fill every quiet moment with conversation or entertainment, being alone can sometimes feel like something we should avoid. But for a deeply empathetic person, solitude may serve a very different purpose. It can become a place where the mind finally has enough quiet to process what it has been carrying. Consider what happens when you spend a great deal of time around other people's emotions. You may listen to a friend's problems, support a family member through a difficult period, or absorb the tension of a workplace without even realizing how much it affects you. If you are highly attentive to emotional cues, you may find yourself constantly monitoring the environment. Is everyone okay? Did I say something wrong? Why does this person seem distant? Should I help? Should I stay quiet? Over time, this continuous attention can become mentally exhausting. The human brain needs periods of recovery. Attention is not an unlimited resource, and emotional regulation also requires energy. When we are constantly responding to external demands, we can lose touch with our own internal experience. We become so focused on understanding everyone else that we forget to ask a simple question: what am I feeling right now? Solitude can create the space to ask that question. When the noise of other people's expectations becomes quieter, we may begin to recognize emotions that were previously hidden beneath busyness. Perhaps we realize that we are angry about something we never addressed. Perhaps we notice sadness that we kept postponing. Maybe we discover that we have been saying yes when we really wanted to say no. In this sense, solitude can become an opportunity for self-awareness, but there is an important distinction. Healthy solitude is chosen with intention. Loneliness, on the other hand, is often accompanied by the feeling that we want connection but cannot find it. The two experiences can look similar from the outside because both involve being physically alone, but psychologically they can be very different. A person who chooses solitude may feel restored by it. A person experiencing loneliness may feel disconnected and unseen. For emotionally sensitive people, learning to recognize this difference is especially important. If solitude is being used to avoid every difficult conversation, it may become a form of withdrawal. If it is being used to punish others or protect oneself from any possibility of vulnerability, it may prevent meaningful relationships from developing. But when solitude is used to reflect, recover, and reconnect with oneself, it can support emotional well-being. This is where emotional intelligence becomes essential. Self-awareness allows us to notice what is happening inside us. Self-regulation helps us decide what to do with those emotions. Without these abilities, a person may simply react to emotional exhaustion by cutting everyone off. With them, the person can pause and ask a more useful question. Do I need distance from people, or do I need distance from the emotional pressure I have been carrying? Sometimes the answer is simply rest. A deeply empathetic person may need an evening without responding to messages. They may need a quiet walk, time in nature, journaling, reading, or simply sitting without having to manage anyone else's emotional state. These moments are not necessarily signs of isolation. They can be moments of psychological recovery. And something interesting often happens when a person becomes comfortable with healthy solitude. They may begin to choose relationships more carefully. Instead of seeking people simply to avoid being alone, they start asking whether a relationship genuinely adds meaning to their life. They become less dependent on constant external validation because they have learned that their sense of peace does not have to come entirely from other people. This does not mean they stop caring about relationships. In fact, the opposite may be true. When we become more comfortable with ourselves, we can often enter relationships with greater freedom. We no longer need another person to constantly reassure us that we are worthy. We can connect because we want to, not because we are terrified of being alone. Perhaps this is one of the hidden strengths of solitude. It teaches us that connection becomes more meaningful when it is chosen rather than desperately needed. The goal is not to build a life without people. The goal is to build a life where you can appreciate people without losing yourself in them. Because sometimes stepping away from the noise is not a rejection of connection. It is the process of reconnecting with the person who has been quietly waiting for your attention all along, yourself. Perhaps the deepest lesson is this: choosing solitude does not mean you have stopped caring about people. Sometimes it means you have finally started caring enough about yourself to stop accepting relationships that constantly ask you to become someone you are not. You do not need to surround yourself with hundreds of people to prove that you are loved. You do not need to remain in every friendship simply because it has lasted for years. And you certainly do not need to sacrifice your inner peace just to avoid being alone. The right relationships will not require you to abandon yourself. They will give you space to be honest, to grow, to disagree, and to be human. And until those relationships come into your life, remember that solitude can be a place of reflection, healing, and strength. So if you are in a season of your life where your circle is becoming smaller, don't immediately assume that something is wrong with you. Perhaps you are simply becoming more aware of what truly matters. Perhaps you are learning that peace is more valuable than popularity, authenticity is more meaningful than approval, and one genuine connection can be worth more than a room full of superficial ones. Take your time, know yourself, protect your emotional energy, and never be afraid of a little solitude if it helps you return to yourself. Thank you for spending these moments with me and for allowing yourself to reflect on something that so many people experience but rarely talk about. I hope you leave today with a little more understanding of your own emotions, your relationships, and the quiet strength that can come from knowing yourself deeply. Wherever life takes you next, I wish you the courage to choose authenticity over approval, peace over unnecessary conflict, and meaningful connection over simply being surrounded by people. Take care of yourself, trust your journey, and remember, your path does not have to look like anyone else's. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the very best of luck on your journey ahead. May you find the people who truly understand you, the courage to let go of what no longer serves you, and the peace to feel at home within yourself. Good luck, take care, and until next time.